At one point, I was assigned to read the book, A Tale of Two Cities. Charles Dickens wrote this book in 1859. With all due candor, I read the Cliff Notes, but I understand it was an historic, I'm just being honest, it was an historical novel, and it centers on the plot as it leads up through the days to the French Revolution. In that book, he wrote something which sounds so familiar to us today. Here's what he said as he opened up that book. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief. It was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light. It was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope. It was the winter of despair. Those words described Dickens' time in 1859, and I think in some ways it does describe the days we live in, doesn't it? And maybe in some ways, the COVID crisis has escalated some of these things. I mean, after all, we live in an age where we could say it is the best of times. Even for a crisis like this, we have so much technology, our medical equipment, everything that we have has allowed us to weather this storm in ways that maybe previous generations would, and it's the best of times, but it is also in many ways the worst of times. Divided and as we are and struggling as we are in so many ways in our culture with the division. It is an age of wisdom indeed, but it also seems at times to be an age of foolishness. It's a great time of belief, but it's also a great time of doubt where we're seeing those who believe being strengthened. We're seeing those who doubt continue in their unbelief. It really is a time of light and darkness. It's a great time, the spring of hope, but it's also a time of despair for so many. Dickens describes his challenging times, and they really are our times. And so in this challenging time that we live in, I'm looking for wisdom from the Scripture. I'm looking to say, what can I say to myself and to God's people during these challenging times? And as I prayed and thought through what was next in our series and studies, I said, the life of Daniel, there's some wisdom there. There's some example there. There's some hope there. In a series that I'm entitling Resolute, I want to begin a sermon series as we study the life of Daniel to help us deal with the challenging times we're facing. You see, we're facing a time of rapid change, just like Daniel was. We're facing a time where God's people are under pressure to change their convictions and their beliefs, just like Daniel was. And so I want to ask the question, what can we learn from the life of Daniel to inspire our response during these challenging times? And what I want to suggest is I hope to communicate to you this big idea that like Daniel, in challenging times, we need God's help to be resolute in our convictions and our beliefs. Turn, if you would, to the book of Daniel. It's in the Old Testament. It's one of the minor prophets. Daniel is 12 chapters long, and we're going to focus primarily on the first 6 chapters, which is his life as it unfolds, from when he was a teenager in Jerusalem and he was exiled to Babylon until he was an old man, living his life as a prophet and as a diplomat in Babylon. His story is a great story to inspire us as we think about how we can live our lives resolute. Let's look at it as we turn to Daniel chapter 1. And I want you to see that as the story starts out, like Daniel, we need God's help as we face challenging times. What were the challenging times that Daniel was facing? Well, first of all, we see that he, his friends, his family were under siege. Look how the story begins in chapter 1 and verse 1. His story begins under siege. What do we see? In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. In those days when a a warring country would come in. The country would be, and in this case Jerusalem, the city would be behind their walls, and they would besiege it. Literally, they would have to climb and knock down the walls and take the city. And so they began that process of besieging that city. It was a scary time. Could you imagine being in that kind of situation? It's almost akin to living in a time of warfare. One of our great saints, Pat Kay, actually lived during the time in England when there were bombing raids through her own place where she lived there in England. I don't know the exact city. Could you imagine living in a time of being besieged by a foreign country, a foreign enemy? And that's what Daniel was experiencing. But I want you to notice that it wasn't just the army that was doing it. There was a sense in which Daniel understood. Look at verse 2. And the Lord delivered. The Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hands, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God. It went from bad to worse. Not only were they sieging the city, but when they finally broke through the barriers and entered into the city, they went into the most holy place of God and they ransacked all of the holy elements and took them with them back to their temple. Things couldn't have been worse. They were under siege. And in some way, God was in control and allowed this to happen. Why? Because the people had been unfaithful, because the people had violated God's law and covenant for years, and they had practiced idolatry. And God had said long ago that I will give you this land and you will keep this land as long as you follow your God. But when you turn from your God, I will bring destruction on the land. And God had warned them repeatedly through the prophets, many prophets before Daniel, and they did not listen. And God brought about this siege and this destruction. Daniel and the people of Jerusalem were under siege, but not only that, but Daniel and especially his friends were exiled to Babylon. They were taken forcefully from Jerusalem and brought to a foreign country, Babylon. Look at what it says next in verse 3. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, the chief of the court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility. Daniel was part of the nobility of those days. He was an up and coming. He would be the one who was ready to go to Ivy League, of his day, and he was ready to be that person. And the king knew that here's what he would do. He would take some of the young men from the country. He would bring them to the foreign country. And he would prepare them to be the leaders of the next generation so that the people that were brought to Babylon from Jerusalem would begin to respect the leaders because now they had their own leaders there too. And so this was a process that they went through. They would conquer a land and they would ransack the land, but they would often bring people back to Babylon to train them and let them be leaders of the people so that people could look up to them and say, oh, these are our own people and they're leading us now. And so as young men, it says in verse 4, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. These men, these young men, teenagers, were carted off from Jerusalem and they had a new home in Babylon. Could you imagine going through that? The change that they experienced was challenging, wasn't it? Not only were they exiled, but they were also assimilated. Assimilation is a word which means a mixing together, a combining of things. And assimilation can be a good thing, right? We talk about our country being the melting pot of the world, right? What do we mean by that? We mean people from various countries and languages can come to our country and they can assimilate, they can melt in, and they can become a part of the fabric of our own country, and we welcome them. There's a good thing with assimilation, but here's the challenge with assimilation. Sometimes people who are assimilated completely forget their traditions, their language, and their culture. So there's a sense in which assimilation can lead to a loss of what they had before. And this was intentional on the part of the king of Babylon. This is what he wanted to do. He wanted to assimilate these men so that they would forget and give up everything that they were taught about their God and their culture and their language, so that they would now just ascribe to the Babylonian system. Notice what it says in verse 4. He was to teach them the language and the literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter the king's service. Who were these men? We read that these men, among them, were chosen from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Yes, Daniel and his 3 friends. But what's interesting is that as they were assimilated into the culture of Babylon, it says in verse 7, the chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, the name Belteshazzar. To Hananiah, Shadrach. To Mishael, Meshach. And to Azariah, Abednego. What's the point of all this? In a sermon preached a number of years ago, Ray Pritchard, which has a great title, he says, The 4 Freshmen, How the World Tries to Seduce the Church. And he talks about this process of assimilation this way. The people of his day, these young men, were experiencing this assimilation, and what was happening to them? They had been given a new home. They went from Jerusalem to Babylon, and therefore they were isolated from their family. They were given new knowledge, and it was an indoctrination. It was to teach them in such a way that they would accept the values and systems of Babylon and forget what they had learned and what they had been taught as youngsters in Jerusalem. It was an indoctrination process. They were given a new diet. And so they were forced with compromise. Well, why is this new diet an important issue? We'll see in a moment, because they were taught how to eat as Israelites, and now they were given all new food which had been sacrificed to idols, and now they had to decide, will we accept what God has told us, or will we live by a new lifestyle? See, it was an issue of lifestyle. They were being told to change their way of life. And they also were given new names, as we see here, new names that would maybe lead to confusion on their part. Why were their names important? Because the Hebrews, every name meant something. For instance, Daniel in Hebrew means God is my judge. But now he was given a name, Belteshazzar, which actually is Bel, protect the king. It's about an ungodly God. It's another God, and it's this king. And now, so the change is going from God as his God to now this foreign God and the king being what his name's associated with. Hananiah means the Lord is gracious, but Shadrach means the command of Aku, which is one of the Sumerian gods. Mishael means who is like the Lord, but he became Meshach, which is who is that Aku. In other words, who is the Lord? Who's the pagan god? His name was directly changed to bring confusion to him, to forget the God that he served, the name that he stood for, and worship another god. Azariah, the Lord is my helper, became Abednego, a servant of Nebu, who was another Babylonian god. Do you see what's happening here? The Babylonians were smart, and really they wanted to assimilate and totally change these men. Here's the question: what would happen to them during this time? Do you know that this process of indoctrination is not something that just happened years ago in Daniel's life? There's a sense in which the culture that we live in today, especially for our young people, is trying to get us to change our values and our beliefs and our behavior, and trying to get us to accept the culture and the values that are antithetical, that are opposite of what God's Word says. And there are a lot of isms in our day that young people and all of us have to wrestle with, because the culture is trying to squeeze us into its mold. It's not just Daniel in his day that had to deal with this. We, young people in our day, need to deal with this. And there are many isms in our day, and I'll just mention 4 very briefly. And in our connection group on Wednesday that we have in person and virtually, we're going to go into more detail and think a little bit about these, but let me just mention four. Four trends, four thoughts within our culture that sometimes our culture tries to squeeze us into its mold, to get us to change our values and to go another way. What are those? One of them is called postmodernism. And what does that mean? It means that truth is no longer T, a capital T, but truth with a small t. There is no foundation for truth in the world. There's no objective standard in the world. Everything is relative, and therefore there's no truth with a capital T. It's merely the truth that I feel and for the day and the moment. There's also naturalism, which sounds pretty good, like nature. But here's the thing. Naturalism says that this universe that we live in is a closed box. There is no external God who created it all. There's no Genesis 1, in the beginning God created. It's all external. It's all internal. And so reality is simply what we can see, touch, and measure by science. So knowledge is only what you can see. There's no revelation. There's no ability to be able to say, "Thus saith the Lord," in naturalism. Subjectivism is that I, as the subject, determine everything about my life. And so we live in a culture which is fiercely pro-choice. And so the idea is that I, as an individual, get to determine my choices in life, and I get to determine my values and everything about my life. Subjectivism, it's just that I am the one in charge. And we see that in a variety of ways in our culture, don't we? And then finally, we see that universalism is also just assumed. What is universalism? Universalism means that every pathway is valid. There is no ultimate truth, and therefore, if there is a God, that God can be, achieved and approached from many different vantage points. It goes contrary to what we read in Scripture, that God has sent His Son Jesus, and there is one way and one truth and one life. And yet, these are the values and the vision of our culture, competing for us, trying to assimilate us, trying to get us to change our values and our way of life and our beliefs. So the challenge that Daniel faced is not a challenge that was once and never to be repeated. Constantly throughout culture, the culture calls us to abandon our values and to accept the teachings of the dominant culture. So how do we respond? Like Daniel, we need God's help to live resolute in our faith. Resolute is the word that I use for this series, and the word resolute means admirably purposeful, determined, and unwavering. And if anything describes Daniel, it is a resolute person who stood his ground, who stood in the face of great pressure. I want you to notice that Daniel's convictions were threatened, but he stood resolute. Look at what it says in verse 8. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. Again, why was the royal wine and food an issue? Because Israelites were taught to honor God in everything they did and how they dressed and how they ate. And there were specific laws and expectations for Jewish people about how they were to eat. In fact, today, I have Jewish friends, and they are kosher, and so they can't eat the same things that I eat. And if I go out to lunch with them, we go to a kosher restaurant to honor them. There's still a tradition and a pattern that they follow that goes all the way back. And so Daniel was, do I give up that tradition, that culture? But more importantly, that food would have been sacrificed to the pagan gods, would have been used in those sacrifices. And so Daniel had to decide, what do I believe? What do I stand for? And he was resolute in his convictions. And when his convictions were threatened, he spoke up. Notice what it says. He asked the chief official for permission. I want you to notice Daniel didn't say, "Hey, yo, that doesn't conform with my way of life, forget it," because you know what would have happened to him. He was wise. He knew that he had to be diplomatic in what he did, but he had to stand up and speak for his convictions. Sometimes we find ourselves in a situation where it's important for us to let our convictions be known, but we must do so with graciousness and respect towards those who differ from us. But nevertheless, he spoke up. Let me ask you a question. When did Daniel develop these convictions? Here's a simple answer. Daniel developed these convictions not in Babylon, but in Jerusalem. See, Daniel developed his convictions in the time of calm, so in the time of storm, he knew what he believed and he stood up for it. When do we develop convictions? We don't develop convictions. Sometimes we have to develop convictions in a time of storm, and then you know what it's like? It's like grabbing a life raft and holding on as the waves are buttressing us. Sometimes we have to do that, but it's much better to actually develop your convictions beforehand in the time of calm. It's much better for young people to learn as they go through life, what God says about them, what God says about the world, and understand there's a creator who has made all of this, and develop those convictions. So when you go off to the storm of life and you're being threatened with values and beliefs that are different than what the Scripture says, to be able to stand your ground. You see, we develop our convictions in a time of calm to prepare us for the time of the storm. And Daniel was ready. I want you to also notice that Daniel stood his ground because he knew that God was in control of the circumstances. Notice what it says about the circumstances in verse 9. Now God had caused the official to show favor and compassion to Daniel. Daniel knew that when he stepped out and stood his ground, that God had his back, that God was going to protect him, that God was going to pave the way, that God was going to work in the heart of the official. And indeed, that's exactly what happened. This official, though, was nervous. Well, what will the king say? What will the king say? But Daniel's faith was in his God, and he understood that God was working in the circumstances. And so when the official was a little bit like, I don't know if this will work. I want you to notice what happened in verse 11. Daniel's faith was stretched during this time of testing. Here's what Daniel said. Daniel said to the guard whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Notice verse 12. Please test your servants for 10 days. Wow. What an act of faith on the part of Daniel to say, I'm going to trust God. That if I step out and if I hold firm, that He's going to hold me in this process. And so he was willing to say, tell you what, we'll eat vegetables for 10 days. We'll eat our food for 10 days. And then you come and see how we fare. And if we fare okay, will you let us continue to do that? What an act of courage. What an act of conviction. What an act of faith. Daniel's faith was stretched during this time. It was a time of testing. See, sometimes God puts us into a time of testing. And the time of testing is not to see us squirm, but to strengthen us. And during this time of testing, Daniel was strengthened. And what happened? Well, the servant agreed to allow that to happen, verse 14, for 10 days. And at the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. God had shown up in the midst of that test. God had strengthened Daniel and his three friends. God had met them in their point of crisis. Their faith was stretched during this time of testing. That's what God does in times of testing, if we'll let Him. Well, as the story goes on in the life of Daniel, we'll see that not only was Daniel physically strong during this time, but increasingly he was displaying great understanding and wisdom, and he established himself as the cream of the crop. Look, if you would, at verse 17. To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning. Here's an important point. Although they had their values and their beliefs, they still studied the culture of Babylon, the language and the customs of Babylon, and put their full effort into it to understand it. In fact, they knew it better than some who had grown up in that culture. They were studious and they worked hard. They learned the culture. Daniel could understand visions and dreams and of all kinds, it said at the end of verse 17. They were being trained into how to study the stars for the future, how to study visions and dreams. And they learned those arts. They learned those crafts well. They studied hard. And look at verse 18. At the end of the time set by the king to bring them into his service, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. Could you imagine that? 3 years. What would happen if it didn't work out? And they present themselves before King Nebuchadnezzar, and here's what happened. Verse 19. The king talked with them and found them none equal. They were the cream of the crop, none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And so they entered the king's service. They passed the test. They showed themselves to be not only faithful to their God, but to be very conscientious about their studies and their work. You see, you can study the culture around you. You can understand the theories. That doesn't mean you have to embrace it and give up your own. You can be at the top of your class. You can know the science of all these things. You can know the theory of evolution, but you don't have to believe in evolutionism, which is that there is no God and everything is random mutation and blind chance. You don't have to accept naturalism to be knowledgeable about all the theories and all of the systems of our day, and that's what Daniel did. Notice verse 20. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. You see, God used Daniel and the training that he received not only to strengthen him, but I actually believe to make him the premier Gentile spokesman to the world. See, for not only was God training Daniel in all of the arts and sciences of Babylon of his day, but God was also pouring into him and revealing to him truths about the future. From chapter 7 through chapter 12, we see that throughout this whole time that Daniel was in Babylon, God was revealing to him the future of Babylon, the future of the kingdoms after that, and on until the future kingdom. You see, Daniel was living in a time hundreds of years before Jesus, and yet Daniel saw into the future to the one who would come. God gave Daniel great vision about the hope of the world and the end of all things in Jesus Christ. See, Daniel faced the lion in his day, right? The lion's den, the story of Daniel we all learned from Sunday school. He faced that with great conviction, and we'll get to that in a few weeks. But as he was learning the customs of the day, God was also giving him revelation about a future lion who was to come. A lion who would be a lamb. You see, Daniel saw the future. He saw that the God of heaven would set up a kingdom. In chapter 2, verse 44, it says, Daniel says, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, nor will it be left to another people. It will crush all those kingdoms and bring them to an end, but it will itself endure forever. We're going to look at that next week, at what God showed Daniel as he interpreted the dream of Nebuchadnezzar. But here's the amazing thing to think. Nebuchadnezzar has a dream, and Daniel is called to interpret the dream. Could you imagine, as a young man who has just been taught in the traditions of Babylon, to be able to stand in front of King Nebuchadnezzar, who was the authority over the whole world, and say, King Nebuchadnezzar, you're a good king, but your kingdom is going to go away. In fact, the kingdom after you is going to go away. The kingdom after them is going to go away. But there's going to be one kingdom established by God that will be eternal. Could you imagine the conviction and the strength that he had to deliver that news to Nebuchadnezzar? And that's what Daniel did. But you see, God, because of Daniel's faithfulness, gave him a vision of a future kingdom that would come. A kingdom that would ascend above all, of a king who would reign and rule. He saw the picture of a lion who would be a lamb, who would reign and rule. He saw a picture of Jesus. hundreds of years before Jesus, Daniel saw him and saw that he would be the ultimate king. And I think that is why Daniel had the strength and courage that he did. He understood that those earthly kings and the power that they had been given to them by God, and that God could rise them up and dispose of them. But in the end, God's kingdom would be established and eternal. And that conviction that he had allowed him to go through the life that he did, the challenging times, because he knew God was in control. And that's what we need to know too. There is a kingdom. That kingdom has already been established by Jesus, who died on the cross and rose from the dead and is seated at the right hand of God, and he is coming again. Daniel saw that and knew that, and that gave him great hope. And so it can for us. There's one more picture that Daniel saw in chapter 9, and it is one of those great prophecies that we will have to take some time, probably next year, to digest. It's found in chapter 9, verses 24 through 27, but there is a picture that Daniel saw of the one who would come. Daniel saw the anointed one and declared, hundreds of years before Jesus came, the exact time of his coming. He got it down to the exact 490 years that he would come from the decree of Cyrus. And he also saw specifically that when this anointed one would come, in Daniel's words, the anointed one will be put to death. God granted Daniel the vision to see the one who would come, the lion who would be the lamb. And Daniel understood that that was the one in whom all of us would put our hope and our trust. And that brings us to a communion table. As we gather around communion, we are reminded that God's plan throughout the ages is centered in the anointed one, Jesus, who would come and who, through his death on the cross, would make peace with God. Do you know that the anointed one whom Daniel prophesied about hundreds of years before is the one that we call Jesus the Messiah? And it is that Jesus who died on the cross for each one of our sins, who rose from the dead, who is at the right hand of God, who is coming again, and whose kingdom will be established forever and ever. That's the Jesus that we serve. That's the person that Daniel foresaw in his visions. Daniel was looking forward to a time when that Messiah would come. We look back at the Messiah and what he has done and look forward to his second coming. And communion always reminds us of that every time we gather.